Today's daf we're going to be learning is Nedarim daf Kaf Gimel. We have very interesting beginning tar daf and very interesting end tar daf. We're going to get to the custom of kol nidrei, hatarat Nedarim on Erev Rosh Hashana, and we'll try to see if we can figure out what the source of the custom is. And we'll talk a little bit about historically how it develops. So first we're going to learn the daf, and at the end we'll add a few minutes of discussion about a super interesting topic that comes right out of our daf. Okay, to recall where we started, where we ended. So we had two stories of rabbi, one was a rabbi, one was I don't think it was, right, both were rabbis who had a vow to dissolve. The first case, right, both cases were similar to the extent that the rabbis couldn't find a petach. The rabbis said, well, if you had done this and that, and they didn't even tell us the details of what the this and that was, if you had known this and that, would you have taken the vow? To which the answer was, continuously, yes, I would have taken it anyway, in which case they weren't successful in finding a petach. In one case, Rav Nachman got very angry about the whole situation, got angry at Rav Schora, sent Rav Schora home, and Rav Schora goes home, he figures out, oh, well, now I have a petach because Rav Nachman got so angry at me. Had I known Rav Nachman would have gotten so angry, I never would have taken the vow. And apparently he goes to, right, it says Yitir La'atzmo, which really seems to mean he went and found another chacham who was willing to undo it based on the new petach. Interesting that they claim, again, it's just the commentary saying it, so we don't really know what happened, but you wonder why he didn't just go back to Rav Nachman and said, now I have a petach, right? He would have made it Rav Nachman's day. The second story is the rabbis are pacing around, or they're spending a long time. There were two different ways to understand the sun to the shade to the sun, right? Either a lot of time passed and they were struggling. They still couldn't find a petach that was going to work. And someone else comes along, Bitnit, the son of Abba Shalom, and Bitnit, and basically says, had you known you were going to cause such distress to the rabbis, would you have done this? To which he says no, to which he then undoes the vow. Next, third story. We're now on about line 8 or 7 or 8 on Daf Kaf Gimel. Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yosi, Havalei nidrei Mishna. He had a neder to dissolve. Onto the Kamayah de Rabbanan, he went before the rabbis. Amrulei, nadarta data tahachi, same exact story. Is this why you took a vow? Amarlu in. In other words, had you known, would you have taken the vow? He says, actually, I would have anyway. Nidarta data tahachi, would you have done it knowing that this would happen? Amarlei in, yes, I would have anyway. Kama zimnin, again, same thing, happened a bunch of times, right? They tried all sorts of options. Kevan now, and this story is going to end a little differently. A little violently. Some launderer saw that he was upsetting the rabbis. He took an implement of his work. Okay, according to one interpretation, it was where you would spray the water out onto the clothing. He took it and he smacked him. Okay, he hits Rabbi Yishmael. Says, how could you be getting that rabbi so upset? To which Rabbi Yishmael says, Amar, that's a demachili katzara lo hadare. I certainly wouldn't have taken a vow, and I known it would have come to this, that he would start smacking me because I did this. And again, in this case, he also found his own. Now, in this case, he didn't actually find it on his own, but it kind of came to his doorstep and, smack in the face. He said, well, now I have a way out because I never would have taken this vow knowing that I was going to get beaten up because of it. Very strange story. To which Amalei Rav Achami Difti le Ravina. Rav Achami Difti says to Ravina, wait, I have a problem with this story. Hi, nolad. You might remember nolad from Shabbat and Yom Tov. He says, nolad, this is a new thing. Okay, now what is a petach? Again, we're getting into how does petach work. So petach, this is a new situation that you never would have imagined at the time of the vow. Right? Would you have thought when I took a vow, okay, let's go back to the woman with her daughter. If I take a vow to forbid my daughter to get benefit from me, I could imagine, right? Maybe I didn't at the time. I was in the heat of the moment. But had I thought clearly, I might have thought about the fact that people are going to think terrible things about my daughter. But would I have thought that some launderer was going to come and smack me because of it? I definitely would not have thought that was going to happen. And so what if it's nolad, right? So they say, first of all, why is it nolad? He would never in his right mind have thought at the time of taking the vow that somebody might smack him because of it. Vita, they would get beaten up because of it. And so what? Well, Chinina, we're going to learn a Mishna further on in Daf Samach Daled. You can already know that when we get to the Daf Samachs, we're going to repeat a lot of things because we keep quoting from there. Chinina ain't potchim lo benolad. What? You can't do a petach from something that they wouldn't have thought about, right? at the time of the vow, because that's what petach is. Had you known, but it has to be something that theoretically you could have known and not something that's totally out there. So what does he answer him? He says, Amrle, Ravina answers, Hi, love nolad. This isn't nolad. Why isn't it nolad? It's a very interesting answer and gives you, we're going to have a bit of insight from a bunch of places into the lives of the people at the time. Remember, Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yosi was a big Talmid Chacham. And oftentimes there were apikorsim in those times, heretics, who would beat up the rabbis. And because there were apikorsim who would beat up the rabbis for all sorts of reasons. So it was theoretically possible, in this case, it wasn't a heretic necessarily, but because it seems like this person was actually defending the rabbis, but there were people who beat people up, and maybe a rabbi would have gotten beat up because he took a vow. And maybe he'd say, oh, look, you rabbis, you're taking vows, and how terrible, and would start beating him up. So basically, Ravina answers, it's not really nolad, okay? Because this is something that theoretically could have happened as a result of making the vow. Again, I don't think this isn't exactly the way it played itself out, but the fact that someone would beat him up on account of his vow is definitely something that was theoretically possible. And it's something he should have thought about, and therefore it is a petach. Okay, now we get to two interesting stories. One is only going to be brought because of the other. It's not like a story in a story. Okay, what we now have is three different stories. Before we even move on, I want to compare the three stories in terms of, number one, how they undid the vow, right? In the first one, Rav Zchora realizes on his own. The second story, it comes about because of someone else who realized it, right? That we can come up with a new petach. And the third story, it's somebody beats him up and then he realizes on his own, but because of some external thing that happens by somebody beating him up. And then the third one, we added this new issue of nolad, which we didn't know before. Now we know, and yet this still isn't considered nolad, and therefore it works. Now we're going to have a story that the Gemara is going to also ask a question, how could this be? And they're going to prove it from another story. Both stories involving women, which makes the story interesting for us as women learning it, and just for anybody learning it, because we often don't get too many stories and insights. It's about the life of women in those times, and both these stories give us a bit of insight. To be to Abaye, the wife of Abaye, you might remember the wife of Abaye. She came up not so long ago in a famous story where she goes to the court to get her, this is a ketubot, she goes to the court to demand her payments, and she wants to also have wine. She used to drink wine every night with Abaye. And after Abaye's death, and she shows him how she used to drink wine, a large amount of wine. She picks up her arm, she shows Rava, and she reveals her arm. And then he comes home and wants his wife to have relations with him. And his wife says, what happened in the court today? And then gets all upset at Chuma that she was kind of trying to seduce her husband, even though it wasn't exactly what was going on. A very odd story. Anyway, there she was called Chuma. Here she doesn't get a name. Maybe it's the same wife. We didn't look up if we really have any history of Abaye about whether he had more than one wife or not, but presumably it was probably the same woman. You can see that she was a bit feisty in general. This story shows it as well. Havaleahi Barta, she had a daughter. Okay, the assumption is here that her daughter was from a different marriage because it calls it her daughter and not his daughter. So she had a daughter. Hu amar lekriva. It was time for her to get married, and they were going to marry her off. So the mother was in charge of marrying her off. I guess maybe she didn't have a husband anymore. Maybe he died or he wasn't in the picture. Because usually we see the husbands marrying off. Here we see the mother. And there's a debate between Abaye and his wife about who she should marry. He says she should marry my relatives. He amra, okay, apropos Parshat HaShavua, right? Go find a wife from my relatives, right? And Avram Avinu. So he amra likliva. She says, I want to marry her off to one of my relatives. Okay, right? To us, it seems weird to marry off to your relatives, but in those days, right, it was very common. Even nowadays, some people, right, as long as it's not a raya, it's fine to marry relatives. You like to stay within the family. So basically, there's this debate. He says, I want you to marry her off to my relatives. And she says, I want to marry her off to my relatives. In order to get her to obey him, what does he do? Amarla, titzal hanaati alach. You will be forbidden to benefit from me. Avart adatai. If you go against my wishes, umin sabale lekriva. And if you marry her to your relatives, you will be forbidden to benefit from me. That's pretty strong, right? And he's basically trying to get her to listen. Azat va'avart al-date. She goes against his wishes. As I said, feisty woman, strong-minded. Ve'in tzibah lekriva. And she marries off her daughter to her own relatives. Until the kamed de Rav Yosef. So Abaye now goes to Rav Yosef. He wants to undo his vow because he doesn't want to be forbidden to his wife. He'll have to divorce her. Amar le, Rav Yosef says to him, Ilu haviyadat avart al-data chumin tzibah lekriva mi adarta. if you really think if you had thought she wasn't going to listen to you and actually marry off to the relatives, which are our own relatives, would you have made this vow? Amar lo. He said, no way would I have made the vow. I really thought that by saying that, I would get her to listen to me. Obviously, it didn't work. We know this in our lives. We don't exactly do this, hopefully not with our spouses. We do maybe sometimes do it with our children, right? We make these empty threats. So he said, was this like an empty threat? Had you realized that I was going to do it, would you have said it? He said, no way would I have said it. Shariat Rav Yosef. And Rav Yosef permits this. To which the Gemara says, this sounds like a regular petach, but it's not really a regular petach. And the Gemara says, Umi shari ki agavna, is it really permitted to do a petach like this? And what's the problem with this petach? So why is the Gemara asking this? They don't really say what the problem is. So the Ran explains, if you look at Mishari Haki, the Ran says, Klomal, Mishari liftoch petach, it's about 12 lines down in the Ran, Shahaneder mochiach hepech meoto petach. The petach is that I didn't mean the neder, right? It's not like I didn't realize the ramifications that maybe my neighbors would think bad things about my daughter. It would be more like I didn't realize the ramifications that my daughter would actually forbidden to benefit from me. Or in this case, he says, if you don't listen to me, you will be forbidden. And now he's saying, well, I didn't really mean that. That's not a petach. Okay? It's actually more like nidrei zeruzin, which the Ran's going to ask as well. So the first question is, right, it doesn't make any sense that you can use a petach that basically undoes the entire neder. It's not saying I didn't realize all sorts of ramifications. It was just saying I didn't realize she wasn't going to listen to me. I thought this was going to work. I thought this was a great tactic to get my wife to be obedient, and it didn't work. To which the Gemara says, and we'll get back to why this isn't nidrei zeruzin, which remember, nidrei zeruzin is when we're negotiating and I say, I won't budge from this amount, and you say you won't budge from that amount, and we make a vow, right? Forbidden to you to benefit from me if I budge from this amount or something like that. And we say, clearly I didn't mean what I said, and it's not even a neder. So why wouldn't we say that here? We're going to get to that question in a minute. So first, we're going to deal with what the Gemara says. Is this really permitted? And do we see a precedent for this elsewhere? To which they say yes. Another story with a husband and wife. Yes, we do, in fact. Vahatanya, there was a Braita that said, so this was in the time of Abaye, 4th generation Amora. Now we're going back to the Tanaitic period. Fascinating. Somebody forbade his wife through a neder to go on Aliyah Regel. He didn't want her going to Jerusalem, to the temple, for the holiday. Now, why he wouldn't want this? Good question. Right, we learned, if you remember, Masechet Chagiga, those who learned it, women are exempt, but they can go if they want to. But right, I was trying to think, imagine a scenario, you have a bunch of little kids in the house, and it's mincha time, right smack in the middle of the afternoon. Husband goes off to mincha, and the wife says, I'm going to, and they leave all the kids at home. The wife's like, wait. The husband's like, look, I'm obligated, you're not obligated, and, sorry, but we both can't go. So something like that, right? If they both go on Aliyah Regel, who's taking care of the children, right? Maybe she's going to put the children in his mother's watch and he doesn't want her to do that. It's complicated. Maybe she's going to bring the kids and he doesn't want the kids with him. And, who knows? Whatever reason, he doesn't want her going on Aliyah Regel. One can come up with 100 reasons. And what happens? You can imagine what happens. She goes against his wishes, goes on Aliyah Regel anyway. Ubalifnei Rabbi Yosi. The situation comes up before Rabbi Yosi. Amar lo. So Rabbi Yosi says, if you had known she wasn't going to listen to you, would you have said this neder? Amar lo. He says, no way would I have made this neder. V'tiro Rabbi Yosi, and he permits it. So again, it's the exact same thing. Where the neder. So it doesn't explain why this would work, but it does say that a petach is allowed in this way because we have a Tanaitic source to prove. Okay, clearly you can do a petach that basically means that I was really doing it just to get her to listen to me. And had I realized that she really wasn't going to listen, like I thought it was a good tactic, had I realized she wasn't going to listen, I never would have done it. And therefore you can undo the vow. Now the question is in the Ran, if you look at the next Ran, in Vahatanya Maaseh Be'echad, about 15 lines down, he says, right, from here you can learn that you can do a petach like this. V'itema. Why is this not? Okay, he asks, what's the difference between this and nidrei zeruzin? Because theoretically, it's the same thing as nidrei zeruzin. When I said, I'm not willing to sell for less than a selah, and you said, I'm not willing to buy for more than a shekel, we didn't really mean what we said, right? So, and there we said, it's just invalid. You don't need a petach. Here you need a petach. It's true, you can use a petach, but you do need a petach. So if you drop down, skip a few lines, he says, Yesh lomar de lo dam. He says, these really aren't similar. Why? De nidrei zeruzin de matnitin ein pivli bo shavim. Shamocher velo shalokach shavim. Shemei olam lo haya dato ala sela or ala shekel. Meaning, when you said, I said, I won't sell for less than a sela, and you said, I won't buy for more than a shekel, neither of us actually meant what we said, because we were both thinking about the middle ground of 3 dinarim. In this case, he actually meant what he said. It's just that he didn't mean really to forbid it forever, because he thought, but the line about, I don't want you going on aliyah regel, or I don't want you marrying your daughter off to your relatives, that he actually meant. So he actually said a statement that was true. That's different from nidrei zeruzin. Now that's a good distinction, but we're going to have to view it in another minute in light of the next case. Okay, so in another minute or two, we're going to have to make a further distinction, because we're going to have another case, and that is going to be nidrei zeruzin, and it's more similar to our case than the other case, and then we're going to ask the question again. So let's hold off for one more minute, and then we'll go back to that. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer. So now we're in a new Mishna. If you want to learn more about Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Shuli Mishkan wrote about it in Flashback this week. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer. If you want to encourage, we keep seeing this kind of situation, you really want someone to eat at your house. Yomar, now it says Yomar lo, he'll tell him, but we're going to, most of the commentaries say get rid of the word to him. Doesn't say it directly to him. He says it kind of, and this is a good question. Somebody asked yesterday, when you say a neder, do you have to say it out loud? Say it in front of people? Do you have to, we're going to see here that maybe one can learn something about it here, not about the neder, but about something we're going to learn in a minute, which is Yomal, kol neder, shani atid lidol, hu batel. Any neder I say in the future will be nullified. It's like crossing your fingers when you say something, right? People claim, oh yeah, I was crossing my fingers, I didn't mean it. So if you make this statement before it, it's called a moda'ah, declaration, and you say, any neder I'm going to make is going to be null and void, and then you say the neder, okay, then it will not be a neder, okay? Now, it can't be Yomar lo, because if you said it directly to the person, well then, when you told the neder, the whole point of making the neder was to make them try to think that you were serious about it, and they'll come eat at your house. So if they knew that you had said, I didn't really mean it, okay, so it's a little different than bli neder, because bli neder, you're saying, I promise this, but bli neder, that's to protect yourself. This is basically, you want to say, I don't really want this to be a neder, but I want the person to think it's a neder, so I'm going to make it in the language of a neder, but I'm going to undo it before I even say it. So I know it sounds a little strange, but we're going to talk about this more. As long as you remember at the time you take the vow that you made this declaration. We're going to have to deal with that. Not so clear exactly what that means. And we're going to learn that the Mishna means something different entirely. In fact, in a minute, and this is, I want to just go back to the point before, so I'm already going to tell you what the Gemara is going to do, which is the Gemara is going to actually split the Mishna into two, and going to say that the first line is actually not even a neder at all. You don't even need a modah. If you say to your friend, you're going to be forbidden to benefit from me if you don't come eat in my house today, and right, that is what we call a nidrei zeruzin. And in fact, when Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, notice his words, even the previous Mishnah was the case of zeruzin. And this is a continuation of that, and it's another case of zeruzin. Now, in this case, zeruzin is basically, right, it's very similar to the woman. You're basically saying, I want you to eat with me. If you don't eat with me, the neder is going to be. And in the end, the neder isn't, because you didn't really mean what you said. Why do we say that there? And we don't say it with the case of Abaye or the aliyah regel case, where we don't say it's nidrei zeruzin, we say do you need a petach. So if you look in the first wide line in the Ran, he asks exactly that question. He says, "V'it tema." If you want to say Mishna, what's the difference? Where Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says it's zeruzin, and there pi v'libo shavim. He really meant what he said. You can't say, okay, again, I'm trying to get a little more in depth today because we have time and it's very, very interesting. If you don't follow all of it, it's fine. This isn't this, we're going beyond the simple reading of the Gemara. But again, case one of nidrei zeruzin is the money thing, which is basically, it's not a neder because you didn't mean what you said, is what we said. You didn't really mean shekel or sela. You meant 3 dinarim. Then we said that distinguishes it from this case, which needs a petach, from the woman who says, the husband who says, if you marry off your daughter to your relative, you'll be forbidden, where he actually meant what he said. This case, again, I see you're asking, so maybe I'll go to repeat what I said, which is the Gemara is going to call this a nidrei zeruzin and say that you don't need anything. It is a nidrei zeruzin, this Mishna according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. So this case, we do have pivli bo shavim. You said if you don't eat at my house, you'll be forbidden to me. And then we basically say it was a meaningless vow. So why don't we say the same thing with if you marry your daughter off to your relative, it will be meaningless. Because again, what does it mean meaningless? It means you didn't really mean it as a vow. You just did it as a manipulation tactic. So the Gemara distinguishes. The Ran distinguishes, The Ran says, next line, in the middle of the line, second line, Yesh lomar de lo dami. Why? Because he says of the type, the content of the vow. He says, Ilu hatam, there ha'inyan mochiach mitocho she'enu ela zeruz. She'en b'achilat chavero etzlo kbeda kol kach sheb'shvil ze yidirenu min chasav dafka. How serious is this issue? If I want you to eat in my house, now it's true we've seen many vows about this topic, but seriously, how critical is it if you eat in my house or not? It's not the biggest deal. So therefore, I wasn't, and let's try to measure me wanting you to eat in my house and me forbidding you from benefiting from me forever or for a period of time. That's not equal, right? It's not a balanced vow. You wouldn't vow against someone because of that. And therefore, it's clear I didn't mean it. It's clear it was just, we all say things we don't mean, right? I swear I'm going to do this. I don't really mean I swear I'm going to do it, right? It's a use of a language. You're just using it to encourage someone to do something in this case. But when it comes to marrying her daughter off, now, it wasn't Abaye's daughter, but still, it was his stepdaughter. He lived with her. He cared about her. It was important to him. It was in his self-interest to marry off to the relatives, his own relatives. So there, he meant it seriously. And there we can't say, oh, it's just nidrei zeruzin. Now, we can use petach, but we can't just say he didn't mean this at all, because it was a much more serious issue. So then you have to rate, right? In other words, again, this is the Ran coming in. It's his interpretation. But what he's doing is he's taking the cases and he's trying to compare them and say, what's the difference between these cases and why is the law different in each of these cases? So whereas we have nidrei zeruzin by negotiation tactics, that's clear because it ain't pivli bo shavim. But when we have negotiate, right, when we have this, if you do this, right, if you don't eat in my house, I won't allow you to benefit from me at all. That clearly he didn't really mean to say that. That it doesn't make sense. Whereas forbidding his wife to benefit from him if she doesn't marry the daughter off, that theoretically he might have meant seriously, which again, we can allow to undo in order for shalom bayit, in order to keep the relationship going, we can allow them to do that, to undo it with a petach, but we can't say nidrei zeruzin. Okay, that's the Ran's explanation. Maybe there's other explanations to come up with, but he distinguishes between the cases in that way. So at this point, we haven't understood the Mishnah yet that it's nidrei zeruzin. I really just jumped the gun because I wanted to go back to that and close that issue before we move on. But in a minute, we're going to say there's a problem with this Mishnah and therefore explain the Mishnah differently. We understand the Mishnah simply as there's one case here. He's talking about a person who forbids his friend to eat. What should he do before he does that? Since he doesn't really mean the neder, he should make a declaration saying, I don't really mean what I'm going to say. And it's not clear, again, whether he has to make that declaration in front of 3 people, whether he needs to make it in front of 1 person. It's not so clear. And particularly if we assume that he made the declaration, he has to make the declaration in front of 3 people. The assumption is that eventually the friend will hear this. In which case, if the friend hears this, it's totally meaningless that he took the vow because the friend knows that he basically said any vow I take is not going to be valid. So then it's totally ineffective, not forget about a neder. It's an ineffective tactic to get the friend to eat because if the friend knows it's an empty threat, just like when your kids know that you're not really going to follow through, it's a meaningless statement. So therefore, since we assume, why we assume is a good question, especially if we take out that word low, right? Maybe you're keeping the word low at this point. But right again, let's read the words. Since you said, Kol neder sheniatid lidor yebatel, your friend is lo shamale, he's not going to listen to you, and he's certainly not going to eat with you because he doesn't believe you that you're really serious. So moving now to Amabet, we're going to reread this Mishnah. And we're going to read the Mishnah like this. There's words missing in this Mishnah, and this is how it should read, and we're going to split it into 2 totally different things. If, and this is what I already told you, if you want your friend to eat with you and he's not listening, and you happen to take a vow and say, you will not benefit from me, in this case, nidrei zeruzin. This is what we call nidrei zeruzin. It's a meaningless vow. You clearly didn't mean what you said. It's obvious that you were just trying to encourage him, and therefore it's not even a vow. Period. Second sentence. If you're worried, going back to yesterday's topic, you might get angry at some point during the year and take a vow, and now you're clear-headed, and you want to prevent that kind of thing from happening. So what do? Yamo b'Rosh Hashana, stand up. Okay, now how we read this next word is an interesting thing. At the beginning of the year, right? Maybe it means literally Rosh Hashana on the holiday of Rosh Hashana, or maybe sometimes in the Torah, in the Tanakh, Rosh Hashana actually means Yom Kippur. You should stand up on Yom Kippur. We're getting closer to Kol Nidrei here. V'yomal, and say, Kol neder sh'ani atid lido yehe batel. Any vow that I will make in the future will be nullified. As long as you remember when you make the vow that you said this declaration, then your vows will be annulled. Okay, we're going to get back to that last part about remembering. We're going to understand the Mishna a little differently in a minute. But basically, this sounds exactly like Kol Nidrei. Now, what do we do at Kol Nidrei? It's not exactly. Why is it not exactly? Because in Kol Nidrei, we do two things. We say all the Nedarim, mi Yom Kippurim she'aval, from last year, ad Yom Kippurim zeh. Say everything in the past is canceled. Umi Yom Kippurim zeh, ad Yom Kippurim haba aleinu l'tova. Now, some machzorim might have one of them in parentheses, and it's not clear, do you say them both? And we're going to show today where that whole machloket came about, and in general, a huge debate about Kol Nidrei in general. Okay, and it's all coming from this line, basically, it seems like. So this is not saying you should say Kol Nidrei every Yom Kippur night. It doesn't seem to be saying that. It's saying if you're a person who's worried that you get angry and you make vows and you want to prevent it, what should you do? It's certainly not talking about vows from last year. It's saying you should annul, right? Make this declaration before the beginning of the year, or at some point, it might not even be really the beginning of the year. Stand up and make a declaration that, any vows I make in the future are null and void. And then when you make that vow, your moda'ah will basically undo your neder, and it won't even be a neder. It's not like petach and charatel that are after the fact. The neder won't even take effect. So now we're going to have to try to understand this. Okay, what we'll do is we'll get to the end of the daf and learn all the details, and then we're going to go back and I'll go further into Kol Nidrei and how it developed. So now the Gemara asks the following. Wait a minute. This last line, as long as you remember B'shat HaNeder, it doesn't make any sense. Izachol, if you remember, I remember that I made a moda'ah and I took a vow anyway. Well, if I'm taking a vow anyway, then aren't I basically saying I could care less that I made that t'nai? I'm basically uprooting that stipulation that I made. What I'm basically saying is, I know that I said I don't want any vows that I make to be valid, but I want to make one anyway. And then basically you're overriding it, and then your vow should be a vow. So the language, now you have to remember, why did they say when they explained it this way? Because they're trying to reread the Mishna. What did the Mishna say? Right? Again, let me just read the Mishna so you see what they did to the Mishna. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, stop there for a minute. That's a nidrei zeruzin. And now, new sentence. Yomar kol neder shani atid lidor hu batel u'bavad she'ezachor b'shat neder. And now they add, if you want to avoid vows, which really has nothing to do with the first part, if you want to avoid vows, you should stand at the beginning of the year, which it didn't say in the Mishnah, right? And say the following declaration, which is, kol neder shani atid lidor, I'm reading the words of the Mishnah now, will be batel. Any future vow I make will be nullified. And the words of the Mishnah are, as long as you remember when you made the vow. So that language doesn't really match this reading. So we're going to have two explanations, one of Abaye, one of Rava. They actually both agree about a basic case, but they disagree about a specific case. So Abaye says, Tni, Abaye's tactic is change the language and just say it means that you didn't remember, because really, why are you making this stipulation? Because you're worried you might get angry in a moment of anger. You'll forget that you said, I don't want to make vows. You'll forget that you were against this whole idea. You'll make your vow and then you'll regret it. So what do they say? Oh, this covers it as long as I don't remember. If I forget, I'm in a moment of anger and I'm not clear-headed, and I forget that I said Kol Nidrei, or, in our day, but let's say, I forget that I made this declaration, and then I vow. So the vow is not a vow, basically. Okay? That's what Abaye says, and then you have to change the language of the Mishna. Rava says, I agree with you that you're right, that if you forget when you make the vow, and you have made this declaration, the declaration will be applicable. But I'm going to explain the Mishnah as also giving an additional case. Okay, what basically Rav is saying is, it's true in a normal case, if I remember that I made this stipulation and I vowed anyway, the vow is going to be a vow, and that's not what the Mishnah is talking about. But Rav says, the Olam Kedamrina Mikar, I'm going to explain the Mishnah with the simple reading that it is that I remember, but I'm going to split remembering into two. There's two options of what I remember. Hacha b'mayaskinan. Kigon, what's the case of the Mishnah? Kigon sheitna b'Rosh Hashana. You made this stipulation on Rosh Hashana. V'lo yada b'mayitna. It's not like our kol nidrei. I made a stipulation that any vow I make about bread will not be valid. Very specific. But I didn't remember later on. I remember that I took the vow, but what didn't I remember? The stipulation. I didn't remember, did I say it on bread or did I say it on wine? Can't remember now. And now I'm taking a vow on bread, and I just don't remember what my original vow was. So, if I remember that I made a stipulation, but I didn't remember specifically what it was about, and what do I say right now? What I say is I'm taking a vow based on my stipulation, which means basically, if I said I won't vow about bread, then my vow is not relevant. If I said I won't vow about wine, then my vow will be relevant. Okay, so if I basically, instead of Izachor b'shat neder, means if I remember in the neder and I mentioned it, and it would have to turn out that I really vowed about bread, we would have to figure it out somehow. I'd either remember or someone would find witnesses who heard me say it and they would come forward and testify, then nidrei lepe mamash. So if my original was about bread, I remembered at the time that I had made a stipulation, but I didn't remember what it was about. And I said, I'm doing it on whatever, my original stipulation still stands. Then my neder is not a neder if, in fact, I had made it on bread. It sounds a little convoluted. Lo amar al dat harishona neder. In other words, Rava has no choice but to make it convoluted because he prefers to keep the language of the Mishnah to its original and not change it to the opposite of what it says. Lo amar dat harishona neder. But if I remembered, but I didn't specify that I'm doing this based on my original stipulation, then it must be akre l'tnei, became nidrei, which is anytime, right? I know that I made the stipulation and I'm vowing anyway, because I'm clear-headed right now, and I know I made a stipulation not to take a vow, but I'm taking it anyway, then my neder will apply. So again, the basic case, though, and they disagree about this weird case, but the basic case they both agree about is if I made this stipulation and I don't remember when I vow, because I was in a moment of anger, my stipulation stands and my neder is not a neder. That's the basis of part of our kol nidrei, which is basically that we're saying any vow we make, right? When we don't remember that we said kol nidrei, right? Because you might, obviously we all know we say kol nidrei, but you might not be remembering at the time you take the vow, that will basically cover all those vows and they will be nullified. That's why, by the way, we have to also go back and nullify vows from the previous year. You might say, if we say anything I say in the future is invalid, why do we have to go back then? Because I basically covered all my vows for the upcoming year. So why in the following year do I have to say last year's? Because some of them might apply. Because if I remember I said kol nidrei and I did the vow anyway, my vow is going to apply. It doesn't fully cover you. Now comes the really interesting line of the sugya. Rav Huna bar Chinina savar l'midrash b'pirka. He wanted to teach this in the big drashot tzibur. He wanted to tell everybody, this is a great solution to vows. Get up at the beginning of the year, like we do, right? And say this. Now you think, great, this is where kol nidrei comes from. But no, because Amar le Rava says, right, he wanted to do this. But Rava said, Tana kamistayim lasatume, kedei shelo yinagu kalut rosh b'nidarim, va'at darash le b'pirka. The Mishnah is specifically ambiguous. It's very interesting. Usually we have a chisur mechasrei v'haki katani where we reread the Mishnah and add words in. It's usually we assume there was a problem with the transmission and it got messed up a little bit. This is a reading of Rava saying they specifically left it ambiguous because they didn't want you to know about this solution. Okay, right? Best kept secret, which is no longer a secret. He says the rabbis didn't want you to know about this because if everybody knows this, then they're going to take vows all the time because they're going to say, oh, we said kol nidrei covers us, right? If I had asked you, would it cover you only if you didn't remember? You probably say, no, you assume that covers all your vows, right? You probably wonder, why did we say it on last year if we already said next year? This is a huge problem. It's going to cause people to start taking their vows very lightly, and that's a real problem. So therefore, you should not teach this in public, and people should not know about this. Okay. I want to go in depth now, but I'm just going to read the last line so that if anyone wants to finish the daf at this point, you can. And then I'm going to go off the daf a little bit into the custom of kol nidrei. So now the question is asked. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov said this was nidrei zeruzin, just like the previous Mishna, the case of the getting your friend to eat with you. The Gemara wants to know, plige Rabbanan alei Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, do the rabbis disagree with him or not? Because it only says Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says this is nidrei zeruzin. Maybe the rabbis disagree. And if they disagree, do we hold like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov or do we hold like the rabbis? And we're left with this question. We're going to get to possible answers in tomorrow's class. Now I want to talk about kol nidrei. So it doesn't actually say kol nidrei here, and it doesn't really say that everyone's supposed to do this. It says if somebody wants to stand at the beginning of the year, it's not even clear they mean Rosh Hashana, Yom Kippur, we don't know, right? Nowadays, just to talk about the custom, we have one custom to say hatarat nedarim, which we do in front of three men, a court. Some people say you could do it in front of women also. We do it in front of three people. We say, please, the first part is all of our past vows, and then we say this moda'ah about all our future vows. Okay, and people do that generally Erev Rosh Hashana. Some people do it Erev Yom Kippur. Then on Yom Kippur, we do kol nidrei. So the first question is, why do we do this twice? There's no great answer to that question. Okay, it seems one does seem more legalistic, and that might be the best answer. The hatarat nedarim is the real thing, and kol nidrei is more of a prayer ceremony, kind of. Okay, and then why? We'll talk about that in a minute. But we don't really see the development of this custom. Often with customs, we see, or tefillot, we see them first when we get to someone who says, don't do this. Okay, and the first mention of it that we have is in the Gaonim time period. And they say the following. Okay, they start going against this, and they say, Lefichach, ein anu osim ki Mishna zo, we don't hold by this Mishna, ve'ein anachu mefirim nedarim, we don't annul vows, v'lo noagim la'afer, lo beRosh Hashana, but lo beYom Kippurim. We don't do this on Rosh Hashana, we don't do it on Yom Kippur. It seems like some people were doing it Rosh Hashana, some people were doing it on Yom Kippur, which, by the way, that also might attest to why we have it twice, because we're following maybe two different customs of the same thing. V'lo shamanu miRabotenu, and we didn't learn from our rabbis, shayu noagim ze kol ikal. Okay, we didn't learn this from our rabbis that they do this. In other words, they see this custom, the people are doing this. I don't know where this came from. Our rabbis didn't talk about this. You should be strict like kmotenu, like us. Ve'al tishnu minhag yeshivot. The yeshivot were the two big yeshivot in Babel. They often quote the two yeshivot. Don't change from this minhag. Okay, where I'm reading. Okay, it's a good question. I'm reading from Otsar HaGaonim. Okay, the Otsar HaGaonim is a collection of Gaonic statements. We don't really have books from the Gaonim, not too many of them. It's collections of statements from the time of the Gaonim. Okay, so this is a collection from there that's basically it's quoted from somewhere else. They found it and they collected, someone more modern day collected all these statements of Gaonim. They're quoted in all sorts of books and put them together in order, like where you would want to find them. It's a fabulous work that he did, Benjamin Levine, that he did to basically do this work so we can find out what the Gaonim held about all sorts of things. We're looking specifically for the Gaonim. This is in the earlier time period before the Rishon. Then another statement in the Gaonim is "V'chidavar kalu be'enechem lachto adam be'inyan nedarim u'shvuot v'yaseh ze b'rosh hashana kodem u'b'yom kippurim v'chaper lo chas v'shalom." Like, this is a terrible thing we're doing because God doesn't want rishaim, and this is a bad thing. And if people knew inyan neder, inyan shvuah lo yumarimim klal, this is like a way that they can, trick people into making vows and doing that. Basically, the Gaonim are very strongly against this custom. Okay. But and in fact, Rav Gaon says that we should really do it more as he doesn't say get rid of it entirely, but he says it should be more of a prayer, that we ask Rachamim from God to help us annul our vows. And that it's more of a prayer. Okay, and this is in the end often the way people view this, as not a halachic thing of actually annulling our vows. And why do we start Yom Kippur with it? Because it's a prayer to basically, by undoing vows, in fact, we talked about vows are like kind of similar to mitzvot, right? Prohibition, and of asking God to pardon us for our sins. And the vows is like an example of sins, or maybe something like that. Again, there's very different approaches in the commentaries about whether this is something real or whether this is something more like a prayer and symbolic. So the Gaonim viewed it as real and said, get rid of this. Rav Gaon said, well, we can view it as a prayer. If you want to keep it, use it as a prayer. So it's clear at this point that it exists, but we don't know exactly from where. Now, Rabbeinu Tam is one of the most famous sources in the Sefer HaYashar. And he says, and part of this is quoted in our Tosfot, but I wanted the Sefer HaYashar is very clear. I wanted to read it from there. It's in the Chelek of the Chidushim. There's two parts. It's Chelek of Chidushim, and I think it's Chelek of Perushim, and it's in Siman Kuf in the 100. So he says the following. Already here, it's being said. Okay, we're jumping ahead a few hundred years to the Tosfot time in the 13th century. My father changed the version to read, okay, you can see now what it was and what he changed it to. Yom Kippurim says it's not about past, it's only about future. And he starts to list, and this is why it's fascinating to read this, because it's a good review of all the things we're learning. He says, right, this must be the right way. Anyone who says it the other way, Eino ela toeh, is totally wrong. It doesn't have anything to do with our past vows, because he took this very literally. And he said, halachically, this makes no sense. You can't do hatarat nedarim under your vows in this kind of form in a shul like this. Why? Number one, first of all, you need regret or petach, right? You need one expert or or you need a beit din. We don't have that in shul. Some people later claim, well, that's why two people stand next to the chazan, him and the chazan count as three. Some people say it's really a tefillah of the chazan, and that's why we hold the Sefer Torah. That counts as a person. It's a whole interesting thing in and of itself. So later, people try to halachically justify it, but he's very against it from a halachic perspective. He says this is not hatarat nedarim. Papa, because he's Batrai, the later one, he says in Gitin, it quotes halacha there, you need to specify, if you want to annul a vow, you have to say what the vow was. You can't just say, I want to annul my vows. You have to say, I want to annul this particular vow, as we saw in the Gemara. And therefore, and he says, and the proof for it is our Gemara. Okay, and he says, here you have it, Rosh Hashana, which he understands as Yom Kippur, and say the following declaration. And therefore, he says it must be only on the future. Comes the Ran, okay, who he already saw, he quotes Rabbeinu Yaakov, which is Rabbeinu Tam. Okay, if you look about 10 lines from the bottom of our page, there's halacha hey in parentheses. After that, he says, first of all, he says some communities say kol nidrei. So it's clear in the time of the Ran, okay, I think the Ran was like 13th to 14th century in Spain, as opposed to Ashkenaz. It says some communities say this, okay, meaning not everybody was saying it, not like nowadays. Kol nidrei ve'esarei. They're referring to this, right? Levatel nedarim lachar miken. But he says their language is mishubash, and then he quotes Tosfot. But then he says a few lines down, en ra'oi lomar ken. Okay, he says you shouldn't say this on the future. He goes against Rabbeinu Tam and says it doesn't make sense to say it on the future because of our Gemara. Because he says, right? And he quotes the Rava, and Rava says the Mishna was ambiguous. Who are we to say that we can do this, right? Rava clearly said, don't do this barabim. It's interesting that Rabbeinu Tam doesn't relate to that at all, right? Some people claim that those days people were more like people, trying to remember what I read, that they took vows and therefore there was a concern they would take them lightly. Nowadays, people took their vows seriously and therefore there was a concern they would take them lightly. Nowadays, people don't take their vows seriously at all and therefore it's not any worse. We're better off helping them and to undo them. In other words, already the situation's so bad that we actually need to help them. In those days, it was a good situation. People were careful about them. If we would have allowed this, people would have been negligent about them. Once people are already negligent, we may as well come up with a solution for them. So that's another approach. There's a million different approaches here to try to explain this. Anyway, he also points out at the end that if someone else vows about you, which we talked about previously, right, that someone could forbid you and then you could go against the neder, obviously kol nidrei doesn't cover that. It's only statements that you make about yourself, not something that somebody else made about you. So in any case, here you see the debate between, is it past? Is it future? Is this a real thing? Is it not a real thing? Is it a halachic thing? If it's halachic, then we have to change it. And maybe that's why we kept kol nidrei, but did hatarat nedarim, which is much more halachic, where you're standing in front of three people and you're actually doing it according to the halachot. And in fact, people there, if you, for example, have a vow you want to get rid of, a lot of people, once they're already doing hatarat nedarim, they'll go in front of those three people that are sitting there and they'll say, listen, I have a particular neder, and that deals with Rabbeinu Tam's problem about tzarich lefaret et ned. So it's an actual big mystery how it developed in the first place. Was it meant to be just a prayer, or maybe it was meant to be a halachic thing, but then people saw all sorts of halachic issues in it, and then, right, either the Gaonim said, don't say this, or shifted it like Rav Hai Gaon into, right, the Gaonim were a lot of people, so there were different approaches. Hai Gaon shifted it into a prayer. We have the Ran and Rabbeinu Tam, who both use it as a halachic thing, but each one had a different version of, is it going on the future or is it going on the past? And then, all different things that came after that, trying to understand what this is. So might have left you a little bit confused about it. On the other hand, you now have a bunch of different approaches about how to understand kol nidrei and hatarat nedarim. That will finish today's shiur. Have a great day, everyone. So it's fun when the Gemara has something very relevant, right? Even though nedarim are not the most relevant in our lives, but everybody knows kol nidrei, Yom Kippur, and what's the meaning of it. By the way, I forgot to mention, there's another halachic issue that comes up, which is you can't be matir nedarim on Shabbat. Rabbeinu Tam also mentions that, I guess not in the section that I quoted. But people say that's why we do it at the beginning of the prayer, because it's not, Yom Kippur hasn't exactly started, which is a little bit odd to say, because first of all, women who've accepted Yom Kippur, when they lit candles, for them it has already started. But it's there's an issue that you can't do hatarat nedarim on Shabbat, and therefore not on Yom Kippur, and therefore, how do we do this on Yom Kippur? And again, maybe it's another reason why it's really just a prayer, and the hatarat nedarim on Erev Rosh Hashana is more the real thing. So with that, we'll end today's shiur. Have a great day, everyone.